Hi folks, and welcome back. This week we're going to talk about a phenomenon known as epistemic injustice. And in particular, we're going to talk about epistemic injustices as they arise in the medical context. But before we can get to that, I have a bit of groundwork to lay. I'm going to begin the video by talking about the idea of justice. I'm going to more fully flesh out the concept of justice that we introduced in the previous weeks. And then I'll turn to introducing you to the idea of an epistemic practice, a practice in which knowledge claims are generated, tested, and shared with one another. And only once we have that groundwork in place can we develop the idea of an epistemic injustice, which is a wrong that is done to someone in their capacity as a knower or as a participant in an epistemic practice. Only once we have this concept in hand will we be able to turn to an analysis of the epistemic injustices that arise in medical contexts in particular. So much of this video is going to be dedicated to introducing this general concept. It's only at the end that I turn to applications to the medical context. I want to begin by thinking in very broad terms about what justice is. Now, we could spend a whole class on this. We could spend a whole semester on this. You could write an entire dissertation on this, and many have been written. But I just want to give a very broad understanding of what the concept of justice is. In the very broadest sense, I think of justice as giving each their due. It's treating each person with fairness, giving them what is due to them. We can think of this in different realms. In the realm of retributive justice, the realm in which we punish wrongdoers or right wrongs that have been done, we give the wrongdoer what is due to them. A just punishment is a punishment that is proportionate to the crime that was committed. In terms of procedural justice, we give each their due in the sense that each person is treated as equal before the law. No one is favored by the courts. No one is treated differently before the law. Procedural justice requires that everyone is treated the same. That is, treated fairly. And in the realm that's going to be most important for us, distributive justice is the idea that in a just society, each person is given the resources that they are due, or is able to acquire the resources that are due to them. So justice has to do with giving each person their due. Injustice, then, is a kind of failure to give a person what is due to them, a kind of failure to treat each individual fairly, or to give to them what they are deserving of. So we're going to be, in particular, interested in injustices that arise within epistemic practices. What are the ways in which some people are not given what they are due in terms of the epistemic practices in which they are engaged? Now let's turn to the idea of an epistemic practice. I asked you to watch a few videos on Descartes, and one of the things that you'll notice in these videos, or that you should have noticed in these videos, is that the Cartesian project is a very individualistic project. It's the idea of the self-sufficient knower who can come to be certain about his or her beliefs from his or her own perspective, all on their own. Right? The self-sufficient knower doesn't need the help of anyone else. In fact, can't rely on the help of anyone else. From Descartes' point of view, when he develops his position of radical skepticism to try to reconstruct only those beliefs that he can be absolutely certain about, he can't possibly trust anyone else, because it's possible that anyone else who he is able to communicate with, who he's able to test his beliefs with, is simply part of the deception of the evil deceiver. There's no escape from his own mind for Descartes. He is quite solipsistic in this sense. This traditional view of the solipsistic, self-sufficient knower held sway in Western philosophical traditions for a very long time. The project of epistemology was, for quite a long time, the project of combating skepticism in just the way Descartes sets out to do. But contemporary epistemology has a bit of a broader scope than this. Following largely in the wake of a number of feminist epistemologists, we've seen a turn toward a position known as social epistemology. Social epistemology focuses instead, rather than on the individual knower, on the social practices in which knowledge is generated. It understands knowledge as a kind of social phenomenon. It focuses on attributions of knowledge, when those attributions, when we say that someone knows, when those attributions are appropriate, when they are inappropriate, what norms or rules govern the practices within which we make such attributions, and within which we generate knowledge claims, and test our knowledge claims, that is, by demanding reasons for them, or gathering evidence, or presenting evidence for them, and in which testimony is shared. So it recognizes that much of what we know from others. We are embedded in an epistemic network or an epistemic community, and much of our knowledge is gained from our interaction with members of that epistemic community. On our own, there's not much, if anything at all, that we can know. We only know as social beings, as we are embedded in these social practices. And that's the position that we are going to begin from as we start looking at epistemic justice and epistemic injustice, because epistemic justice and injustice are phenomenon that arise within these epistemic practices. They're ways in which the norms of those practices are either misshapen or misused in particular circumstances. So let's turn now to the idea of epistemic justice. We can, in some cases, think of epistemic practices as economies. This is a loose analogy, but it's going to be helpful to think in these terms when we turn to questions of epistemic justice. So an economy is, in the broadest sense, just some mechanism for distributing resources. We can have a command economy that does it through central planning. We can have a market economy that uses market mechanisms to distribute resources. And the resources in an economy can be distributed in just or unjust ways. They can be distributed fairly or unfairly. Each person can have what is due to them by virtue of this distribution, or can fail to have what is due to them by virtue of this distribution. So what are the resources that are distributed in an epistemic practice, if we're thinking of it on analogy to an economy? Well, there are a bunch of different kinds of resources that might be distributed within an epistemic practice, but the particular epistemic resources that are going to warrant our attention are resources like credibility, knowledge, and concepts, along with capacities for expertise and understanding. So let me break this down a little bit. Credibility is a resource within an epistemic economy that everybody wants, but not everybody can have. It is a scarce resource. Some people are rightly treated as more credible than others because they are more reliable at reporting on the things that they have seen, and they are less likely to mislead or tell lies. And credibility is a valuable resource because if you are someone who is judged by others to be credible, then you have some power within this epistemic practice. You can shape the beliefs of other members of your epistemic community because they're going to take you at your word. They're going to believe what you tell them, and that's a pretty significant power to have. So credibility is one of these scarce epistemic resources that gets distributed. Knowledge itself is a scarce epistemic resource that gets distributed within knowledge practices. Some people have it, some people don't. Everyone wants access to it because knowledge is power, and not everyone can have access to it. Some knowledge is tightly held. Trade secrets, government secrets are tightly held bits of knowledge that not everyone can have. So they're a scarce resource that's distributed in this economy. And concepts themselves are another scarce resource that is distributed within an epistemic practice. Concepts are the sort of shared stores of our understanding. They're what we use to name things, to express ideas, to communicate ideas to one another, and to understand the world that we inhabit. And concepts are something that we construct in our society, or in our social practices. We construct these concepts together, and we use them to enhance our understanding and to communicate with one another. But some concepts are considered the purview of a dominant group, and non-dominant groups just don't have access to them. So some concepts are taught only in elite institutions. Some concepts are learned and understood only through the family ties that one has, or only through the social ties that one has. And if one lacks those social ties, then one will never gain a facility with those particular concepts. And they won't be able to develop the understanding that comes along with those concepts, or become experts in the use of those concepts. So if someone can control the way in which these concepts are distributed within an epistemic community, there's a great deal of power to be had there as well. So this is what we want to think about. We want to think about epistemic practices as these social practices on analogy with an economy where particular resources are distributed among the practitioners. Credibility, knowledge, concepts are distributed among the epistemic practitioners. When things are going well, when it is a just epistemic practice, these resources are distributed in a just way. That doesn't mean that everyone is treated the same. That doesn't mean, of course, that everyone has access to exactly the same epistemic resources. Some people are going to be treated as credible because they are reliable reporters, and some people are going to be treated as uncredible because they are not so reliable. They're liable to tell lies or say misleading things. Some people are going to have access to bits of knowledge because of the social position that they hold, and we rightly judge that people in that position ought to have access to this knowledge and others ought not to. Say, for example, doctors with certain medical knowledge, we think they ought to have it, and others maybe shouldn't have as ready access to it. So a just distribution of these resources is not an equal distribution, but it's a fair distribution, one in which everyone gets their due. Let's turn then to what an epistemic injustice is. This is a term coined by Miranda Fricker, and she says that an epistemic injustice is basically an unfair distribution of these epistemic resources. It is a wrong done to someone in their capacity as a knower, a wrong done to someone in their capacity as a participant in one of these epistemic practices. So these resources are not fairly distributed to them. They are suffering from an epistemic injustice, in just the way that someone who doesn't receive their fair distribution of the material resources of a society is suffering from a material injustice, an economic injustice within that society, or someone who is not given due process, not provided with due process before the law, is suffering from procedural injustice within their society. We've got the same idea going on here. And Fricker breaks down epistemic injustices into two types: testimonial injustices and hermeneutical injustices. Let's take each of these in turn. A testimonial injustice is one that arises in one's capacity as a provider of testimony or provider of evidence for claims. So let's think again about this credibility economy. Let's focus in actually on this one resource, credibility, and think of the epistemic practice as a kind of credibility economy. We each make credibility judgments about one another. We make judgments about who is a credible reporter and who isn't, who is trustworthy and who isn't, whose claims we ought to act on and whose we ought to question or be skeptical of. So we make these kinds of credibility judgments of one another, and we rely on a whole lot of evidence in doing this. We rely on one's demeanor, we rely on the way that one presents themselves, the way that one speaks. We rely on our background knowledge about the individual speaker. We rely on our background knowledge about the point in question, about the content of their claims. But there are a few things to note within this credibility economy that are of central importance. One is that we tend to grant default entitlement to people when they make claims. We have as our default to take people at their word. We take them to have good reason for the claims that they are making. We take them to be entitled to the claims that they are making. So when someone speaks, when someone says something to you, your initial reaction, unless you have some reason to be skeptical, is to take them at their word. If someone tells you about the crappy commute that they had this morning, not that anyone is right now, but if someone tells you about their crappy commute, you don't ask them for any evidence for this. You simply take them at their word. If someone tells you about the wonderful dinner they had last night, you don't ask them for any evidence. You simply take them at their word. But there are cases where we don't simply take people at their words. Sometimes we have what we'll call a defeater for someone's claims. Defeaters come in two types. There are both rebutting defeaters and undercutting defeaters. A rebutting defeater is one that rebuts the content of the claim that is being made. So when you have a rebutting defeater for someone's claim, you know, or at least are fairly certain, that the content of the claim that they are making is in fact false. You have some evidence that it's not the case that what they're saying is true. So you can rebut the very content of the claim that they make, and on those grounds judge their claim not to be credible. An undercutting defeater is different, though. You can have an undercutting defeater for someone's claim even when you have no reason to think that the particular claim is false. You have no knowledge about the content of the claim whatsoever. An undercutting defeater is the kind of defeater you have if you have reason to think that the person who's making the claim is unreliable in this particular context. So let me give you a couple of examples. One is the example of someone who's colorblind. My mom, for example, is colorblind, and I know that when she makes claims about what color something is, I ought to take those claims with a grain of salt. I have an undercutting defeater for her claim that this shirt is red. That doesn't mean that I think she's trying to mislead me. It doesn't mean that I think that she is trying to utter a falsehood. but it means that I come to this claim with a bit of skepticism because of what I know about her reliability in making such judgments. Another example. I've got my friend Matt. Matt is one of my best friends. He was my roommate in college, has been one of my best friends since. Matt is one of the most trustworthy stand-up guys you could ever ask to know. He will always be there for you if you need help with something. If he gives you his word, he will follow through on it. He doesn't flake on you. He's always going to be there for you. He's that kind of a stand-up guy. But Matt likes to embellish a bit when he tells stories about, his night out on the town, about how he spent his weekend, about the people he met when he was at the club last night, or about the exciting adventures that he had when he had a little too much to drink last night. When Matt starts telling you these stories, you really shouldn't believe Matt. And you know this about Matt. You compartmentalize in this way. You've got an undercutting defeater for his claims about his nights out. This is what I mean. This is what we mean by an undercutting defeater. In knowing Matt, I know that he has a propensity to embellish on these stories, to exaggerate a bit. And so I don't take these stories at face value. I take them with a grain of salt. That's the idea of an undercutting defeater. Now, rebutting defeaters and undercutting defeaters are not themselves instances of injustices. Right? They are things that inform our credibility judgments. If we meet someone and we continually have rebutting defeaters for the claims that they're making, we start to find ourselves with an undercutting defeater for many of their claims because, well, we've found that they're not trustworthy. We found that they're not reliable in reporting on the things that they've experienced or the things that they've seen. And as such, we become skeptical of the things that they tell us. And rightfully so, right? We should be skeptical. If we have reason to doubt what someone is saying, then we shouldn't trust what they're saying to us. That totally makes sense. They are not themselves testimonial injustice. The problem of testimonial injustice arises when people are suffering from undue credibility deficits or benefiting from undue credibility excesses. An undue credibility deficit is a failure to attribute the credibility that a speaker is due. So in some cases, we fail to take a person to be as reliable as we ought to take them. We fail to attribute to them the credibility that they are deserving of. In these sorts of cases happen quite often in conjunction with other forms of discrimination and oppression. There are, for example, stereotypes of women being overly emotional and hysterical, or of trans women in particular being overly emotional and hysterical and too sensitive because they are on hormone replacement therapies. And to treat a woman's claim about some experience that she had or some injustice or harm that she has suffered as uncredible because she is a woman would be to treat her with an undue credibility deficit, or encumber her with an undue credibility deficit, and to commit a testimonial injustice against her, to not believe her simply because she is a woman. We also see this arise in conjunction with racial discrimination and racial oppression. If we don't take someone's word on their their own experiences of racism, We don't listen to their accounts of the racist experiences they have suffered, or we don't listen to their accounts of their mistreatment at the hands of police, and do so not because we have some good reason for doubting their claims, but simply because they're black and black people are likely to play the race card. Well, that is encumbering them with an undue credibility deficit. That's making an unjust credibility judgment about them. And so they are suffering in that case from a kind of testimonial injustice. One thing that we should see here is the tight relationship between testimonial injustice and other forms of oppression. Testimonial injustice is supported by these other forms of oppression. It relies on stereotypes that are generated in these other systemic forms of oppression. And it also serves to reinforce these systemic forms of oppression, because if a black person, say, suffers from testimonial injustice when they try to report on the racist experiences that they have had, or when they try to report on the unjust treatment they've suffered at the hands of police, then the dominant group is not going to be accepting of their claims. They're going to judge them as uncredible, and as a result are going to not recognize the injustice that has occurred. They're not going to be able to see it for themselves because they're not in the proper position to be able to see it. They don't have the proper standpoint to be able to see it. But they're also not going to allow the claims that would make this injustice evident to be heard. So testimonial injustice has this really tight, interlocking relationship with other forms of oppression. Undue credibility excesses are a kind of flip side of undue credibility deficits. These are attributions of credibility that the speaker is not due. We often treat people who are in positions of power as more credible than they ought to be treated. Men are often treated as more credible than they ought to be treated, especially when claims of sexual assault or of sexual harassment are made against them. So men often benefit from an undue credibility excess when they find themselves in a he said, she said sort of circumstance. And women suffer from, historically have suffered from an undue credibility deficit. We can see actually the Me Too movement as a response to just this kind of undue credibility deficit and undue credibility excess. The Me Too movement is an attempt to reset these epistemic norms, to challenge the credibility judgments that historically have been made, and to try to cause us to reflect on them, to believe the claims that women make when the only evidence that's available is their testimony. Let's move on now to hermeneutical injustices. A hermeneutical injustice is slightly different from a testimonial injustice. That's why it has a different name. Hermeneutical injustices have to do with the unjust distribution of knowledge and concepts within an epistemic community rather than the unjust distribution of credibility within an epistemic community. Miranda Fricker understood hermeneutical injustices in terms of an unjust distribution of what she called hermeneutical resources. Hermeneutical resources, she said, are our shared tools of social interpretation. Hermeneutics is the practice of making meaning or understanding the experiences that we have in a shared way. We come to a shared understanding of these experiences by the use of certain concepts or tools that we each understand because we've had experiences of them, because we've learned to use them together. So if you say that you have a headache, I understand what you mean. If I say that my allergies are bothering me, you understand what I mean, because we have shared hermeneutical resources for making sense of these experiences. If we lack those shared hermeneutical resources, various problems can arise. You might not be able to understand something that I claim, something that I have experienced when I try to explain it to you, if we lack these resources. Or you might have certain resources that you don't allow me to have access to. You reject my access to those resources, and so I can't come to make sense of the experiences that I am having because I lack those resources. Each of those is a different kind of hermeneutical injustice. So Fricker defined hermeneutical injustice as the injustice of having some significant area of one's social experiences obscured from collective understanding, owing to a structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. Well, what the hell does that mean? Well, hermeneutical injustices are the result of hermeneutical marginalizations, and these marginalizations can take two forms. One form of hermeneutical marginalization occurs when, as I just said, someone is, or some group, because of their identity, is prevented from accessing certain hermeneutical resources, certain resources that we need for making sense of the experiences that we are having. So on a kind of micro level, you can imagine coming to work in a new office. And every office has its own norms, its own lingo, its own acronyms that they use, its own office speak. And you need to have access to those hermeneutical resources in order to function in your role in that office, in order to make sense of the instructions you're being given by others, in order to communicate your needs to others, in order to understand why others are acting in the way they are toward you, or why your clients are acting in a particular way toward you. You need to have access to these sorts of resources. Now imagine coming into a new office and being excluded from the opportunity to access those resources. You hear people using this language, you hear people talking, but nobody will explain to you what it means. You don't get to go into the meetings where that language is used on a regular basis so that you could come to learn for yourself what it means. You don't get to go to the private golf club on the weekend with the boss to learn what it means and to become adept at using this language. No, you're excluded from it. Now, you would suffer as a result of that. You would lack an understanding of the very processes that are going on around you, and you wouldn't be able to communicate that lack to anyone. So that's a kind of marginalization that occurs when you are prevented from, or an individual is prevented from accessing certain resources. Another kind of marginalization that occurs, another kind of hermeneutical marginalization that occurs, is when a non-dominant group develops its own resources for making sense of its shared experiences, or when the members of the group develop their own resources, their own concepts, their own practices for making sense of their shared lived experiences. But they do so in a way that the dominant group refuses to recognize. So their practice in which they make sense of their social circumstances is itself marginalized, is not recognized by the dominant group. This is what has been dubbed willful hermeneutical ignorance. Dr. Gail Polhouse gave it this name, willful hermeneutical ignorance. But it's a concept that Patricia Hill Collins was working with, though she hadn't named it in this way, since at least the early 90s. She's been talking about Black feminist epistemology, the idea that Black women have practices of making sense of their own social circumstances, have standards of evidence among themselves, have standards of claim making among themselves that are different than the dominant hermeneutical resources. They rely on narrative more than evidence in many cases. They rely on the reliability and cohesiveness of a narrative more than the say, quantitative evidence that can be given in its support. And they have developed concepts for understanding their own circumstances, but these concepts have not percolated up. And these practices have not percolated up to the dominant, the dominant epistemic practitioners, the dominant social group, to white men in society. Dominant groups have been willfully resistant to giving uptake or recognizing these non-dominant hermeneutical resources. And we can see why, because these non-dominant hermeneutical resources reveal the effects of the particular injustices that these non-dominant groups suffer. And so if the dominant group can prevent them from expressing the injustices that they are suffering, then the dominant group doesn't need to address those injustices. They can continue to benefit from them. One prime example of this sort of willful hermeneutical ignorance that has thankfully been overcome is the example of sexual harassment in the workplace. Sexual harassment in the workplace is not something new. It's something that has happened ever since there was a workplace, probably. But it wasn't until the 1980s that feminist scholars started putting language to the experiences of women in the workplace that recognized those experiences as a harm that they were experiencing, as an injustice that they were suffering, in terms that could be recognized by the legal system, that could be recognized by the courts. It wasn't until the term sexual harassment was coined by Catherine McKinnon and other feminist scholars in the 80s that women could point to these shared experiences and say, hey, that creepy guy in accounting that constantly tries to hit on me, or that boss that tries to grope me, and I didn't give me a promotion last year because I pushed his hand away, right? They used to be able to tell stories about those guys to one another and say, stay away from them. Those guys are creepy. Those guys are a problem. But they didn't have language to talk about their shared experiences across different office environments. It was a thing that happened to some women in some places here and there, not a widespread phenomenon. And once the language of sexual harassment became commonplace, we started to understand just how widespread this phenomenon is. Again, the Me Too movement is a part of helping us understand just how widespread this horrible phenomenon is. It's clear why these sort of storytelling practices that existed before then, the narrative practices that existed before the naming of sexual harassment remained non-dominant practices, remain parts of the non-dominant practices. Why this sort of willful hermeneutical ignorance was practiced, it was because it was useful in protecting the perpetrators of this harassment. It was useful in keeping the women who experienced it silent. And that leads us into our next bit here. Christy Dotson, another more contemporary feminist scholar, has named some aspects of hermeneutical injustice. testimonial quieting and testimonial smothering, she has called them. Testimonial quieting is a little bit like testimonial injustice in that in instances of testimonial quieting, the individual's claims are discredited or not accepted. But unlike instances of testimonial injustice, in instances of quieting, it's as if the speaker didn't speak at all. No credibility judgment is even made. So as Rachel McKinnon put it, for the wrong, often racist or sexist reasons, the audience doesn't regard the speaker even as a possible source of knowledge. So it's not like we listen to you but then judge you to be uncredible. It's rather like, because of who you are, because you are black, or because you are a woman, or because you are trans, or because you are bi, or because you are an immigrant, we're simply not going to listen to you at all. Whatever comes out of your mouth, we're just going to ignore it. That's testimonial quieting. We just don't even hear you. And it feeds into a kind of hermeneutical injustice because it supports willful hermeneutical ignorance. We don't even try to listen to your claims. We don't even take the time to make credibility judgments. We're never going to, or the dominant practice is never going to incorporate the ideas that you are expressing. She also named what she called testimonial smothering. In cases of testimonial smothering, the speaker herself withholds testimony. So rather than the hearer being willfully ignorant or judging the speaker to lack credibility, the speaker herself simply withholds testimony. But this sort of self-censorship is a direct response to the recognition that an audience is unlikely to give adequate uptake to one's testimony. So the speaker isn't just silencing herself because she doesn't feel like speaking or because she doesn't think what she has to say is important. She's not excluding herself. Rather, she's smothering her testimony because she recognizes that it will receive a hostile uptake from her audience if it receives any kind of an uptake at all. So it's the kind of act that someone who, say, suffers a sexual assault but is afraid to come forward, afraid to say anything about it because they're afraid they'll be shamed or their family will blame them, or the person who is accused of this assault is in a position of power and will be able to exact retribution on them, or the person who is accused of this result is in a position of power or authority, and others will come to their defense, and so she just doesn't speak up. That's testimonial smothering. That's the idea that Christy Dotson is trying to develop here. So we can see how these various ideas, testimonial injustice, hermeneutical injustice, willful hermeneutical ignorance, testimonial quieting, and testimonial smothering, all are interlocking and both results of and supportive of broader systems of oppression. They allow us to ignore, they allow us to marginalize the voices that would make us aware of these broader systems of oppression. Let's finally turn to epistemic injustices as they manifest in the medical context. How do these injustices done to individuals in their capacity as knowers come to bear on medical encounters? Well, the first thing to note is that doctors are people. And as such, they carry with them all of the prejudices of their social context. So doctors, like the rest of us, are likely to have prejudices, either explicit or in the form of implicit biases, against people of color, against gay and lesbian folks, against gender nonconforming folks, against obese folks. All of these prejudices that exist in our culture, in our society, are likely to exist within medical practitioners within that society as well. And as such, patients suffer many of the same epistemic injustices in the medical context that they suffer outside of it. They suffer testimonial injustices, hermeneutical injustices, testimonial silencing and smothering in the medical context in just the same way they experience it outside of that context. But the medical context gives rise to some problems of its own. It compounds the problem of epistemic injustice. This is a result of differences in expertise and authority in the medical context. Doctors tend to be much more educated than many of their patients, and certainly have more expertise in the particular questions that patients are coming to them to ask about than their patients have. And this can give rise to a kind of epistemic injustice where doctors tend to judge their patients to be less well informed, to be more ignorant, to be non-compliant is a term that's often used, to be unlikely to follow through with the recommendations that are given. This can give rise to a kind of epistemic injustice. The doctors also tend to use a lot of jargon. The medical context tends to use a lot of jargon, a lot of language that is not commonly used outside of that context, and many of us have a difficult time navigating that jargon. And maybe we're able to express our symptoms or our experiences in a language that we have developed or that we are comfortable using to describe them, but that doesn't quite fit the jargonistic language that the doctors might use. And so we have a difficult time describing our own experiences to those medical practitioners in a way that they are going to find relevant. That gives rise to a kind of epistemic injustice. There are also differences in education. And finally, illness itself gives rise to epistemic injustices because illness itself carries with it various prejudices. We tend to think that people who are ill, especially people who are suffering from psychological dysfunctions or psychological ailments, are incapable of providing relevant information about their own conditions, or perhaps incapable of making judgments about their own conditions. And so they face a kind of uphill epistemic battle in trying to get medical practitioners to hear them out, to listen to their claims. Illness also makes it difficult to talk about our own experiences because illness presents us with experiences that are novel, things that we haven't experienced before and we might not have the language to talk about. And so we experience a kind of hermeneutical gap between the way that an ill person expresses their symptoms and the way that a doctor needs them to be expressed in order to understand them and integrate them into the medical decision-making process. Kidd and Carell focus in particular on two aspects or two modes by which epistemic injustices arise in medical contexts. They note that doctors often treat their patients as incapable of giving relevant information, incapable of giving the relevant kind of testimony that is necessary for making a medical decision or for achieving a diagnosis. And they give two different modes by which this manifests. One is what they call participatory prejudice. Participatory prejudice is a prejudice among doctors and others that people who they encounter aren't good at judging what's relevant to this particular conversation. So we might start by thinking about talking with our children. We certainly have participatory prejudices against our own children. I certainly have them against my own children. I think that many of the things that they offer up as relevant to the conversation are simply not relevant to the conversation, and that they're not good at judging what's relevant. And so I'll often dismiss their questions or dismiss certain stories that they're telling that they think are relevant, but that I deem to be irrelevant to the conversation. And that may be treating them unjustly in certain circumstances, but children are still learning to judge what is relevant. The more serious problems arise when encounters between two capable adults lead to these sorts of participatory prejudices, where one of them decides that the other can not judge what is relevant to these present circumstances, and so their questions are dismissed. The personal research they brought with them is set aside. The narratives they give about their illness are ignored. That is what they have in mind with participatory prejudice. The patient might ask questions that the doctor just deems irrelevant and so just steamrolls right over. The patient might have brought in a folder full of research that they've done on the internet, but the doctor doesn't want to take the time to go through it because they think most of it's probably irrelevant, and so they set it aside. Or the patient has a long story to tell about their own illness, about where they think it begins, about how these symptoms started manifesting for them, and the doctor simply sets it aside and says, no, I don't need to hear that whole story. All I need to do is do a physical examination and hear your present symptoms, and then that's all the information that I need. The other form that this prejudice takes for Kidd and Carell is what they call information prejudice. This is a case where doctors judge their patients to be incapable of providing relevant information. So it's not that they can't judge what is relevant, but that when relevant information is demanded or requested from them, they're incapable of providing that sort of information. And so they doctors come to treat their patients as kind of truncated subjects, or with a form of truncated subjectivity, such that they are not treated as capable of engaging fully in the epistemic practice. They're not permitted to contribute to that practice in ways that would redirect the practice toward their own concerns or toward their own experiences or toward their own narratives. Rather, they're treated as a kind of object or quasi-object, a kind of instrument that can give particular little bits of information that are going to be diagnostically relevant. So the doctor will ask very specific questions and seek very specific answers about a patient history. They don't want an entire narrative of this particular illness that the patient is suffering from. So this is the idea of truncated subjectivity that is related here to participatory prejudice and information prejudice. So we can see that epistemic injustices arise in a variety of different ways in the medical context, both as a result of broader social prejudices and as a result of the kinds of prejudices that arise in the doctor-patient relationship itself, and as always, these epistemic injustices serve to re-entrench those prejudices because patients aren't allowed to redirect these epistemic practices in any significant way. So that's it for this week, and we will pick up next week looking at another way in which doctor-patient relationships can go wrong, or another phenomenon that challenges these relationships by focusing on systemic prejudice or systemic oppression in the form of misogyny.